The old man's hope. Henry was an old man. His hands were rough from years of hard work, and his face was marked with time. He had worked all his life, not for himself, but for his family. He worked in the fields, in factories, and did anything he could to make sure his wife and children never went hungry or lacked anything. He was proud of his work, proud of his family. His wife, Mary, was his partner in everything. She cooked the most delicious meals, cleaned the house, and took care of the children. She was his rock, always there to support him. Together, they raised 3 children, 2 boys, Mark and Luke, and a girl named Sarah. Henry and Mary worked hard to give their children a good life. As the years passed, their children grew up. They moved away, built their own lives, and started families of their own. Henry and Mary were happy to see their children succeed. But then, one day, everything changed. Mary fell ill. At first, it was just a cold, but it quickly became worse. She couldn't get out of bed. She grew weaker each day. Henry stayed by her side, holding her hand, doing everything he could to take care of her. He cooked her favorite meals, made her comfortable, and tried to keep her spirits up. But despite everything, Mary's condition didn't improve. One quiet evening, as Henry sat by her bedside, Mary took his hand in hers. Her voice was soft, but her words were clear. "Henry," she whispered, "promise me you will look after our children. They will need you." Henry looked into her eyes, tears filling his own. "I promise, Mary. I will always look after them, no matter what." Mary smiled faintly, closing her eyes for the last time. Henry stayed with her until the morning, but when the sun rose, she was gone. His heart was broken. His life had changed in an instant, but he kept his promise. He would take care of their children, no matter what it took. After Mary passed away, Henry was left alone. His children, who had once filled the house with laughter and love, were now far away, living their own busy lives. Henry missed them terribly. The house felt empty without Mary. He spent his days alone, cleaning the house, tending to the garden, and sitting in his chair by the window, waiting for his children to visit. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. His children never came. Henry was too proud to call them. He didn't want to be a burden. He knew they had their own lives, their own families, but the loneliness began to eat at him. He missed his children so much. One day, his children came to visit, but it wasn't the visit Henry was hoping for. They sat down with him, and Mark, the oldest, spoke first. "Dad, we've been talking," he said. "We think it's time for you to move to a home, an old people's home. It's better for you. They'll take care of you there, and you won't be alone." Henry's heart sank. He had spent his whole life caring for his family, but now they were telling him to leave the house that he had built with his wife, the house where they had raised their children. He didn't want to go. "I don't want to go," Henry said, his voice shaky. "This is my home. I want to stay here, where your mother and I lived. Please don't make me go." But Mark and the others insisted. "Dad, it's for the best. You will be safe there. You will have everything you need. We'll visit you, I promise." But Henry didn't believe them. He knew deep down that they were just saying what they thought was easy. He didn't want to go. But what could he do? His children were grown, with their own lives and families. He had no choice. That day, Henry packed his things, took one last look at the house, and left. He went to the old people's home, a place for people who had no family left to care for them. The place was clean and the people were kind, but it felt cold to Henry. It wasn't home. It wasn't where his wife had cooked dinner or where his children had laughed and played. It was a place for people who were forgotten, and Henry felt forgotten. At first, Henry tried to keep busy. He walked around the garden, helped the nurses, and tried to talk to the other old people. But they were strangers, and Henry couldn't find the comfort he needed. Every day he sat by the window, watching the world outside. He watched as the families walked by, smiling, talking, sharing their lives together. He wondered if his children would ever come. He wanted to call them, but he didn't. He didn't want to feel like a burden. Every night, he lay in his small bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering when his children would come. But they never did. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. One day, a nurse named Maria came to Henry's room. She had been kind to him since he arrived. She noticed that Henry wasn't smiling as much. She gave him a small notebook and said, "Henry, Write down your feelings. It will help. Write letters if you want. It might make you feel better. Henry took the notebook, but he wasn't sure it would help. He had tried everything else to keep busy, but his heart still hurt. He missed his family so much. He missed Mary, the way she would smile when he came home. He missed his children, the sound of their laughter. So Henry began to write. He wrote letters to his children, one at a time. He wrote to Mark, his eldest son. He wrote about his life, about how he had always tried to take care of them. He wrote about how much he missed them. Each day he wrote more, hoping that one of them would come, but none of them did. Not one visit. His heart grew heavier with each passing day. One night, as Henry lay in his bed, he couldn't sleep. He thought about his children and how he had raised them, how he had worked his entire life for their happiness. He thought about Mary and the promise he had made to her. He thought about the life he had lived and how it had all led him to this lonely place. Suddenly, he heard footsteps outside his door. They were slow, but they were real. Henry's heart skipped a beat. Could it be one of his children? The footsteps grew louder and then stopped outside his door. Henry's heart was pounding in his chest. The door opened slowly, and there stood Mark, his eldest son, with his wife and children. "Dad, we are so sorry," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We should have come sooner. We were wrong to leave you here. We've been so busy, but that's no excuse. You've always been there for us, and we should have been there for you." Henry's eyes filled with tears. He hadn't seen his son in months, and now here he was, standing in front of him, apologizing. Mark came to Henry's side and hugged him tightly. "We love you, Dad," he whispered. "We've missed you so much." For the first time in a long time, Henry felt his heart lift. His son and grandchildren were here, and it felt like home again. "I'm sorry, Dad," Mark said. "We should have never sent you away. You belong with us. We've all been so busy, but we promise we'll visit more. You don't have to be alone anymore." Tears streamed down Henry's face as he held his son. "I've waited so long for this day," Henry whispered. From that day on, Mark and his family visited Henry every week. They spent time with him, took him out for walks, and brought him back into their lives. Henry was no longer alone.